Catherine Templeton, come on up.
I wasn't sure who the next speaker was when he started speaking. And my fellow unelected bureaucrat, you know, Governor Jindal used to be in the cabinet as well. So as we ache for this responsible, transparent, and responsive government, we're quick to use words like politician and government employee in a negative way. But let's all agree that the absolute ugliest word you could call somebody is an unelected bureaucrat. So I stand here tonight to tell you, as an unelected bureaucrat, that we are the ones you should care about the most. We are the ones you should pay attention to the most. Ronald Reagan used to have a saying that personnel is policy. And what he meant by that was, in order to effectuate the policies of the president, you had to hire people who both supported those policies and had the ability to get those outcomes. But that's who's running your government. It's not the elected officials. It's not even the political appointments. We have seen what unelected bureaucrats can do. I think Mallory just gave us an example in the Secret Service. That was an unelected bureaucrat. In the IRS, that was an unelected bureaucrat. In the Health and Human Services Department, they couldn't even get a website up. That was your unelected bureaucrat. But think about it in the context of war. In a war, the outcome that you want is to win quickly, without breaking the national treasury, and with as little harm to life as possible. But victory requires strategy, deployment of resources, knowledge of the landscape, and experience at shooting and at being shot at. So who do you want in charge of your soldiers? President Obama? A congressional subcommittee on how to create regulation to inform our boys and girls on whether to shoot or duck? No. You want generals. You want the generals. A swift victory with minimal damage comes from the generals. You want the generals to be given a resource, parameters, and a direction. And then you want the smartest, most experienced, most wily general that you can find. Our government is failing because the executive branch of government is full of unelected bureaucrats that are not generals. The chief executive officer hasn't managed. He hasn't had to meet a budget, and he hasn't had to use common sense to deal with the very real administration of government. We have to have experienced business people running the daily, practical, outcome, critical services that support this country and this state, and those people need to have intelligence and common sense. They have to be able to know where to cut, where to fund, and they have to create better outcomes for our citizens. Now, 20 years in the private sector, after working in manufacturing, doing management consulting, and as a lawyer fighting labor unions, it was quite a departure for me to go into government when Governor Haley was elected. I didn't have a relationship with Governor Haley when she asked me to serve as her labor secretary during our state's fight with the National Labor Relations Board over Boeing. But to her credit, and why these elections matter, she recognized the need to put someone in that position with practical experience facing off against the NLRB and the unions. I stayed at the Department of Labor for a little over a year because that was all it took to beat the unions and reform the agency. In that year, I was personally charged by the NLRB. The governor and I were sued in our official capacities and individual capacities in federal court, and Boeing was pulled into a fight because it wanted to create non-union jobs in South Carolina. At the end of the year, the NLRB had to drop its charge against me. The federal court told the union that Governor Haley and I were right, but the Boeing suit got settled while keeping our non-union jobs here. But we had also managed to reform the actual business of the Department of Labor, which is in charge of regulating every single solitary profession in this state except for lawyers. We cut 25% of the fixed costs, returned millions to the taxpayers, cut fees, stopped operating programs so the private sector could take over, put licensing online, testified in hearings to deregulate entire professions, and we did it all while measurably increasing customer service response time from 24 minutes to 32 seconds with the resources that we had. Then I got a call from the DHEC board because they said they wanted a reformer. They had recently turned over, and they were made up of successful business members that were appointed by Governor Haley. DHEC is the largest, most complex agency in the state of South Carolina with a $600 million budget, 3,600 employees, and well over 100 locations statewide. No other state in the nation organizes their programs like we do. That should tell you something. Everybody else has 4 for our 1. It's a monstrosity. So we took over DHEC. We had 10 layers of management, no central leadership. We were running a deficit, and we weren't administering the programs we were required to by law. I'm trying to talk fast because there's so much. In the first 18 months, we saved $68 million. We refused $10 million in federal tax money. Tens of million, not 10. It was actually $67 million. We're now getting our environmental permits out the door 40% faster, but they have integrity because our appeals haven't gone up. We survived the federal government shutdown and sequester. We hired more boots on the ground to serve you, and we've done it without asking the General Assembly for one dime. As much as possible, government should be run like a business, but it doesn't happen. And it took me a while to figure out which 3 examples I wanted to give you, but let's start with this one. Government makes promises like businesses do, and they should be held accountable for those promises. The Department of Energy promised South Carolina that it would clean up the #1 environmental threat to this state, which is high-level hazardous waste at the Savannah River site. The federal government has missed so many deadlines and ignored its responsibility for so many years that waste now sits in decaying tanks that were not intended to still be around. And the tanks are sitting in groundwater. Do you remember Fukushima? That's what happened. And we've had 2 earthquakes in Aiken in the past 6 months. In the last year, no one has ever taken them to task. No one's ever made them be accountable. They've just let the deadlines go and go. And this year, even though they promised to clean up their mess, they didn't bother to ask for enough money in their $5 billion budget to clean up these tanks. It would take 0.03% of their budget to take care of it. And just like businesses and government should be accountable, people have to be responsible. But our government seems to enjoy just the opposite and seems to enable it. In South Carolina, obesity kills the most South Carolinians, makes the most sick, and if prevented would save the state the most money in health care costs. And when I say health care costs, I mean Medicaid. While obesity is a personal responsibility and not any of the government's business, it becomes our business when we pay for food stamps on the front end, and then we pay for the Medicaid health care related costs of obesity on the back end. We're paying twice. In South Carolina alone, it is an $8.5 billion annual cost to us for obesity health care related costs. And finally, just like businesses, to get anything done, there has to be communication and common sense. Take the EPA. Every year they put $20 million in federal tax money into our state. Right now I have an account that has over $300 million that I can't spend and I don't need. I asked them if I could put it into the safe drinking. $50 million into safe drinking, they said, no, we can't transfer it. Can I give you back $300 million and you'll give me $50 million? Nope, the rules say no. Can I do anything to get the money where it needs to be? No, the rules say no. So it isn't just the unelected bureaucrat that keeps government from running like a business, it's the rules that we operate under. And where it gets dicey is when you have an agency head who wants to make reforms that make sense. And when it gets very dicey is when the laws and regulations are created in a vacuum. And you can't move money from one pot to the other, and you can't fix it. Now, Mallory, I have a how you can fix it, but I'm out of time. I have 3 pages of how you can fix it.
Okay, questions. Let's take some questions. Questions, okay.
So how do you think we can fix it?
I love you. That's great. So what if I told you that if you gave me $1 or if you gave me your money, trust me with it, which, by the way, you do it to the tune of $600 million a year, I could give you a 300% return on your money this year and a 1,000% return on your money within the next few years. You ever heard of predictive analytics? If you took the $20 billion with the B dollars that the Department of Treasury says they are going to lose in fraud at the IRS next year, that's 4 times, 5 times, 4 times I can do math. That is 4 times the Department of Energy's budget. I think they could fix our tanks. In obesity, if you took my $8.5 billion that we're spending on obesity, that is 5 times the budget that we need at the Department of Transportation in South Carolina to fix our infrastructure, and we'd still have $1 billion to play with. Predictive analytics.
Okay.
Is our Attorney General filing lawsuit over the Savannah Riverside issue?
Not yet. What we have done is we've invoked the penalty. They have a stipulated $155 million penalty, and they've invoked ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution. So we're in the process of figuring out how many different ways we can hit them on that. We offered them, from a business perspective, to take the penalty and put it back into the site to actually fix the tanks. And their response was, not only are we not fixing the tanks, but we'll take the penalty from SRS's budget. I love my job.
Please stand up.
Yeah, I have another question about SRS. I mean, clearly it's probably one of the most polluted sites on the planet, and it's, there's no secret that it's been poorly managed for many years. What can the state do, and what is the state doing to protect the workers at that site and the people in the Aiken area who live in close proximity to that site? I mean, I think this is a serious issue that is not getting the attention it needs.
I could probably speak in detail for hours on that, and we'll be glad to meet with you about that. But we do everything from check the milk that comes out of the cows and the fish that are in the water and tissue samples to making sure that every worker that comes in and out doesn't have a radiation level that's too high. We have tritium forests that absorb into the trees the tritium. SRS has actually been managed well given the context of the rest of the complex.
Time for one more question.
Can you give us some kind of a report on the status of the port deepening? I know your folks are involved in that.
So right now, we are one of the people who permits the port deepening. It is ahead of schedule thanks to our last Corps engineer. Barbara Melvin at the port is currently, I don't know if it's been announced yet what depth. Has it been announced what depth we're going to get? Because if it hasn't, I'm not going to announce it myself. I think it's going to be fun. Right now, they're not having to put speed cones in. They're not going to have the trouble that Georgia had, for example, with the oxygenation. So, I mean, it's ticking along really well. Quickly, and I don't see any choke points.
We can take one more question, if there is one. One more question. Okay.
I'm in the industrial coatings business, and I'm glad you brought up the megavault, which they're building right now at Savannah Riverside. We had the contract to line the new megavaults. So if there is a leak, it will not get out in the soil. My contract was canceled because they felt like they didn't need to put the protective lining inside.
Again, why we need the money to clean it up. Yep. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.